Here to discuss research needs and opportunities, please welcome USDA Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, Ann Bartuska.
Well, good afternoon. I just joined you about a half an hour ago, and I'm just like surprised and disappointed that I couldn't have been here all day long, because this just has seemed like a really wonderful session. And what I was asked to come and maybe share some thoughts about the research and science underpinnings that USDA is pursuing that really hopefully supports everything else you've been hearing, and help give ourselves enough time to talk about it. Okay, now there's a top one, there it is. The one that has the green arrow, thank you. And I'm going to jump really right to the slides, because I really want to get into some of the discussion and then open it up for questions. I come into this whole subject because I grew up in Philadelphia, because I work for USDA, but perhaps most importantly, I'm an ecosystem ecologist who all of a sudden has been exposed to how do we bring food systems into the social ecosystem of urban settings. And it's been a really exciting evolution that's taken place in the ecological community, but especially I think at USDA as we have began thinking about the whole world of urban systems and therefore urban agriculture. This particular graphic is just to give you a taste for the types of science that is being done and the opportunities, I think, in those areas. You heard about the Urban Ag Toolkit, and I will end with that. Well, what I'm hoping is that the science that we've been pursuing and the applications actually continues to support the toolkit at USDA, but also the other work that's been discussed here. Some of the things that I think are not well recognized is that we actually, at USDA, through the 1978 Farm Bill, established an urban and community forestry program. So we've been working in urban environments for quite a long time. And what we have learned is that there's such a tight connection between the greening of cities and the social well-being and the human health aspects associated with those systems. So although our initial efforts looked at the forest inventory activities, planting trees, that's, I think, is really where we came from, how those trees get connected to overall watershed functioning and thinking about urban systems as big watersheds of different kinds, some of them hardened surfaces, but clearly from a watershed perspective, connecting green infrastructure into those watersheds. The work that's been going on in Baltimore, for example, is how do we take the vacant lot system that has developed there and turn it into permeable surfaces that can reduce stormwater runoff. Minneapolis, St. Paul did analysis that they could reduce their stormwater payout by $30 million by strategic planting of trees. So that's real money for a municipality, and those are the kinds of changes that could take place. Looking at urban areas from the standpoint of ecosystem services, what values do they bring? More recently, we've been talking about pollinator and pollinator health and reviving and making sure honeybees have habitat and bumblebees do not get on the endangered species list. Well, urban systems can play a role in that setting, and through strategic plantings can actually help increase that. The overall opportunities, therefore, around urban sustainability, it's not just the built structures, it's also the human structures and the systems associated with that. And then lastly, I have already mentioned human health and well-being, but the science behind that. And so I'm going to touch a few examples on that to just pique your interest. This is just a slice of the Baltimore LTER, which stands for Long-Term Ecological Research Site. Baltimore is one of 2 urban LTERs that were funded by the National Science Foundation. And essentially, they were established to provide long-term information and data regarding the functioning of urban systems, as well as to be able to connect to practical solutions in those urban areas. And what started out as a pretty straightforward watershed project, although instead of going to a stream doing sampling, our graduate students were going down manholes and doing stream collections underground, which in itself was an interesting training for them. But one of the things we rapidly realized is you couldn't really study these urban ecosystems without bringing in social systems very, very quickly from a science perspective. Of course, we had human communities there. They were part of the infrastructure. But being able to connect those dots. And so one of the things that came out of the urban long-term studies is the development of stewardship mapping efforts, and so we call it StewMap. But this allows us to not only map the green infrastructure of cities, but also the social connections within those systems, and to be able to lay out the linkages between community groups and official activities that the government might be sponsoring, to local leaders, and be able to lay that out as a social map in an urban area that would help inform really what the opportunities were, but also the direction of the research. And this is what a stewardship network looks like for one of our cities. And if you went into the details, you note that one block would be church groups, one would be community groups, one would be municipal organizations and local governance. And so being able to lay that out, just as we would lay out a tree map or a green infrastructure map, the social connections are increasingly important. Okay, so why do I bring all that up? Well, first, let's just show you that there's a very strong base for work in urban systems at USDA, that we come at it from a systems perspective, which I think is a really important way to connect all of the different pieces. But now we have increasingly been asked to look at the urban agriculture piece, and it is recent. This is one of the things that, as I've been going around to a lot of our research projects in the urban areas, it hasn't been that long ago that we actually started moving from community gardens that were more subsistence-based to actively integrating urban agriculture and urban practice or agricultural production practices into that ecosystem, using that green infrastructure for farming practices as much as for putting in trees. And so this emergence of urban agriculture as a topic that you've been hearing about all day has also emerged within our research enterprise. And how do we most actively and productively bring that in? Some of the work that's going on in our urban research, and some of these concepts I think will feed directly to what you've been hearing about today. First, I'm going to the upper right in crop production. Doing production research in urban areas is different than doing it in Iowa or Georgia or California. So the size is different, the spatial dynamics, the patterns and the social structures associated with it. So being able to learn and understand better what works in urban settings, as well as the germplasm or the plant material that you could be using to really promote optimal production in those areas. One of the social science aspects of this is there's a lot of nutritional opportunities associated with the produce that's grown. So it may not be solving the food security problems of the world through urban ag, but it certainly is addressing the nutritional aspects of producing produce, fresh fruits and vegetables, where people are in a time interval that gives you the optimal nutritional quality from that. So being able to look at nutrient-dense produce, the types of material we're using is also part of our nutrition program. And so in terms of social science research, if you think back to what I was describing with the Baltimore study, one of their aha moments was as they took a step back from these pocket parks and gardens that they were working on from a watershed, all of a sudden they realized their community was really getting into it. And in fact, even though this is some of the low-income, most violent, historically, neighborhoods in Baltimore, They, in fact, had community partners who really managed and protected their research areas. And they started realizing there was a tremendous social science opportunity to better understand the relationship between community dynamics, learning. They actually were able to introduce green spaces into schools in the central part of Baltimore, which is basically asphalt recreational areas, became green space. And the kids learned differently, and they were picking up STEM education ideas from working in nature. And so how do you capture that from a science perspective? I mean, anecdotally, we can get it, but to build a scientific underpinning for that. So the opportunity to look more at the social science research and human interactions about these systems really came to the fore, and connecting it with the urban infrastructure and the biophysical research that was being done. Perhaps the most interesting growth area from a lot of the students I talk to and as I go around the country is in the technology associated with vertical farming. Now, vertical farming takes a lot of different views or different shapes. One I've seen in practice in Chicago it's in a company called Farmed Here, where they just have tiers and tiers and tiers in an abandoned warehouse of flats that have basically aquaponics going on. They're producing in 1 month, they produce 400 pounds of fresh basil and fresh greens, turning it over continuously. There's testing of LED systems rather than incandescent lights, which save on the energy cost, but also produce and increase the photosynthetic capacity of plants. So the science associated with that is not only the technology of building it, but how do you really accelerate and improve how photosynthesis occurs to produce the most nutrient-dense product you can. They were telling me that the microgreens that they were producing of broccoli and radish and several different cabbage-type plants was 40 times more nutrient-dense than the adult versions of that. And so just throwing a handful of microgreens on your salad increases that much nutritional quality. How do we verify that? And that's part of the science that goes into both the vertical farming technology development as well as into our nutritional research. But the whole shape of vertical farming is what goes on inside a building and how you can take advantage of abandoned warehouses and abandoned structures like AeroFarms has done in Newark, or that you have seen in other places where it's the infrastructure on the outside of the building that really integrates energy management, heat exchange, the light density, and water systems with the outside, and it basically creates a frame around a building. Questions are how you retrofit those systems, or do you have to build them in? And then, of course, there's the whole rooftop agriculture opportunity, which if you've talked to or heard about EUDC's work, is right at the forefront of the kinds of things can be done. So, but this is really an emerging area, and I really am very excited about the connection between architecture and urban agriculture, because I think that is really at the heart of some of the changes that are taking place. So we know if you look at the science that's being done in the practice, all right, we're improving practices, the production, water systems, we're improving the genetic material and access to new germplasms that can optimize growth. We're looking at vertical farming from a technology standpoint, from a robotics standpoint, and that systems associated with that. We're looking at the social science aspects. The big question is how much food is produced in an urban environment? You know, we have the Census of Agriculture at USDA, and it has been capturing information on production in the United States for decades. It helps shape policy, domestic agricultural policy. It helps support the risk management programs in terms of production. It helps tell us what farms are adapting and adopting new energy practices to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we have this vast network in rural America that helps us understand what is going on in production agriculture. There is no equivalent, really, for all of urban ag. And yet we know that there's a lot of production taking place. So within our program, we are now trying to figure out how do you capture this urban production in a way that is meaningful, that gives due credit to the volume, to the nutritional characteristics, to the actual dollar value associated with these environments that is actually a viable part of our agricultural system. So lots of opportunity here and areas that I think we will continue to be promoting. And then, so the last thing I'm going to leave you with and then open up for questions is a lot of that science came forward in my programs, and we turned around and pivoted to the other 14 agencies at USDA. There's 16 of us all together, and said, all right, well, what do you have that is supporting urban ag? Because we started being asked all these questions by our county extension agents. I go to Ohio City Farm, and they say, yeah, we just didn't know where to go for composting information. How do you find that out? So hopefully the Urban Ag Toolkit, which I believe Eleanor Stormer introduced you to this morning, will help us get there. We don't want to end with that because I think we're learning as we do. We're learning what more new programs are needed, what the opportunities are for really enhancing urban agriculture, and in particular, better understanding the community structure. And I guess my last comment is, as I have gotten to all of these different activities, again, whether it be a community garden to a enhanced farm that is feeding produce into restaurants and other facilities, to the true commercial operations that we have in many of our cities. It is better understanding the community dynamics that go along with it, because there is an incredible social interplay, not just the social structures that support urban ag, but how does urban ag actually feed a different way of interacting in the social science environment, including education and including reconnecting kids to the world we live in. So lots of opportunities, and I'm happy to chat with you all and maybe get, if there's questions or other comments that you have, and I'll leave you with the Urban Ag Toolkit as my little meme up there. Thank you. And I guess I'm supposed to look at the ones that have the greatest number of votes and respond to those. So I'll do that. And the first one is, where are the biggest holes in the current research? One is certainly what I mentioned with regard to the census of agriculture. How do we measure and monitor and then value the production in urban settings? Because it is such an array, and you can't go to one place, and you can't use aerial remote sensing like we do with many of our farm situations. So how do we capture the value? And the reason you have to do that is because it actually demonstrates to people what is part of the economic base, so that decision makers and municipalities see there's a connection. It's just not a hobby farm, but it's actually producing something. But also, how do you connect it to the number of people and the demographics? So I think that is a huge, huge hole. And as I mentioned, I think emerging technologies associated with vertical farming are really an important growth area. The whole area of water management and recycling of water and creating systems that allow fully integrated energy and water recapture in these, and especially if we could retrofit buildings and retrofit neighborhoods to do that, I think is an opportunity. And that's not USDA's job. USDA should be working with others, but there's a whole host of organizations, including Housing and Urban Development, I think that could be pursuing that. All right, here's a good one. The next one, 6 votes. How can research efforts combine conservation biology and biodiversity with urban ag initiatives? Great question, and one that I think we saw an inkling of as we've looked at our pollinator habitat. I actually saw a project this past year in Ireland where they were putting in the edges of their urban agricultural system, which was actually pretty substantial. It was a couple acre area. And I've seen this in New Mexico, and more recently, where was I? I think it was Georgia. You're putting in buffers that are native plants. They look a little messy, they look a little weedy, but they actually are providing habitat so that you can bring in the pollinators to the system, but also once you bring in pollinators, you bring in birds. So you're creating little pockets of biodiversity. So that's one simple example. I think we have to better understand what is that matrix in the landscape that allows you to do that in a productive way without getting into issues about food safety, because as you bring in birds and you bring in rodents, you also start bringing predators in, and you also start potential to bring in disease. And we don't really have a good understanding of that interplay, but there is some research going on. And the Phoenix long-term research site, for example, is looking a lot at rodent dynamics associated with the urban areas and how that is affecting systems. And then perhaps the one thing about conservation, and that's the water management. And the more we can create a system of permeable surfaces that provide this green infrastructure, we really can be reducing stormwater runoff, which does minimize and mitigate stormwater into our major bays, estuaries, et cetera. And so it is a really dynamic system that we could be connecting with. USDA is actively doing climate change impact research on ag production. Where does urban ag fit in? Well, the one area that I immediately go to is greenhouse gas management, and to the extent that you can be using urban agricultural systems to be absorbing greenhouse gases where appropriate, as well as to minimize methane production, and if you can be recapturing some of that production for energy purposes, there's an opportunity there, and we are looking at reducing using greenhouse gas emissions that way. The other is in resilience and being able to use new germplasm, some that we've lost historically and that we're rediscovering, genotypes of plant systems that allow us to be a lot more flexible in whether it be drought systems, high temperature systems that actually do contribute to the climate change research in the sense of being able to understand what the full dynamics of plant systems are. I can only take one more, and okay, I'm gonna take on this one. It doesn't have the largest number of votes, but I like it, and that's how do you see colleges and universities as catalysts for agricultural research? What we need is those of you who are students and those of you who are interested in these areas to be upward reporting that this is an exciting area. It's about butts in the seat, as they say, getting people into classes, getting people into curriculum, and conveying that this is something that's important. I've been to quite a few academic institutions where people are looking for programs that actually help them do something that returns something to their community. And over again, and especially in many of our minority serving institutions, they really do want to learn to bring something back. And I think agriculture, and especially emerging the 21st and 22nd century of agriculture, can really do that by helping us address food security, food deserts, and nutritional quality of food. And I think altogether, it's an incredibly dynamic place, and it's one that just has so many new opportunities. So I'm looking forward to seeing more come from our academic institutions as these areas develop. And I think with that, my time is up. I'm watching the time reporter here. So thank you very much for your attention. And I guess my last comment is the Urban Ag Toolkit is online, and we love feedback. And if you want to get involved in Urban Ag in the future, you've heard from a lot of people today that will help you do that. So thanks.